Get on your knees and wipe it up. It's about as filthy as you are." Laughter broke out across the break room as Priya Sandhu tipped her cup sideways and let scalding coffee splash across the floor and onto the forearm of Marcus Reed, a single father who had been wearing the janitor's uniform for exactly 1 week. Trevor Voss stood next to her, egging him on while Marcus lowered himself onto the wet tile in front of a room full of watching coworkers. Nobody stepped in. Nobody knew who the man in gray actually was. Would they still have been laughing if they'd known? The first thing anyone noticed about the new janitor at Ashcombe Industries was that he never introduced himself. He showed up on a Monday in a gray uniform that looked issued rather than fitted, pushing a cleaning cart down the east hallway of the 12th floor while the sales team argued about quarterly numbers around him. Marcus Reed was 38, quiet in the kind of way that made people forget he was even there, and he never corrected that impression. He took the bus to work and wore shoes that had been resoled more than once. He said good morning to everyone and expected nothing back. Ashcombe Industries occupied 14 floors of a downtown tower and employed close to 2,000 people, most of whom had never spoken to anyone below their own pay grade. The building had a rhythm, and Marcus picked it up fast, which conference rooms cleared out at 11, which stairwells the smokers used, which managers left their doors open so everyone could hear how important they were. He moved through all of it without comment, as far as anyone could tell, just a man with a mop and no opinions. A few people noticed things that didn't quite add up. He lingered at the internal bulletin boards longer than a janitor needed to. He once asked a facilities supervisor why overtime logs were routed through a single department instead of going straight to payroll, and the supervisor just blinked and said he didn't know, and Marcus nodded like that had answered something. He spoke in full sentences, calmly, with the kind of steadiness usually found in people who'd sat in rooms where real decisions got made. But nobody followed that thought very far. He emptied trash cans. That was the whole of him, as far as they were concerned. His partner on the floor was Dolores Kim, a woman in her 50s who'd been cleaning Ashcombe's offices for nearly 2 decades and knew the building better than anyone in the executive suite. She showed him where the supply closets were, which elevator to avoid at lunch, and how to vanish when a meeting ran long. On his 3rd day, she pulled him aside near the service corridor and told him there were 2 people he needed to watch for. "Priya Sandhu," she said, keeping her voice down even though the hallway was empty. "Middle management, 3rd floor. She's decided she's going to run this company one day. She doesn't see people, she sees titles. If your title's low enough, she stops seeing you at all." Marcus leaned on his cart handle and waited for the second name. "Trevor Voss," she continued. "Sales. He's good at it, which is the problem, because it means nobody ever corrects him. He likes an audience, and he figured out a long time ago that the cheapest laugh in this building comes from picking on someone who can't laugh back." Marcus thanked her and went back to work. He didn't ask why she was warning him. He already understood she'd watched this happen before, more than once, and that the warning was the only protection she had left to give anyone. It took less than a week for both of them to find him. Priya spotted him first on a Wednesday, mopping the 3rd floor lobby, forcing her to walk around the wet patch in heels. She stopped, looked at the floor, looked at him, and announced loud enough for the front desk to hear that some people needed to learn to work around a schedule instead of expecting the whole company to work around them. Marcus apologized and moved his cart. She waited until he'd finished before walking through, making sure everyone saw her wait. Trevor found him that same afternoon. Marcus had just finished the break room on 12 when Trevor walked in with 2 colleagues, yanked a stack of napkins from the dispenser, and dropped them on the floor he'd cleaned 4 minutes earlier. Trevor looked at the mess, then at Marcus, and said it was a good thing they kept someone around for exactly this. The colleagues laughed because laughing was easier than not laughing. Marcus picked up the napkins. In their eyes he was the perfect target, too quiet, too ordinary, and most importantly, powerless. No title, no allies above him, no leverage at all. In a building where everyone measured everyone else by what they could do for you, Marcus Reed could do nothing for anyone. So it escalated the way these things always do when nobody stops them. Trevor started timing his messes, waiting until Marcus finished a section before dropping a stirrer, a receipt, a crumpled proposal, calling out over his shoulder that he was creating job security. Priya began summoning Marcus on his 15-minute break to wipe down a conference table that didn't need wiping, then stood there with her arms crossed while he did it, giving him tasks that weren't his job, not because they needed doing but to see if he'd refuse. He never refused. He did the work, said nothing, and rode the bus home. Dolores watched all of it and said nothing either, because she'd learned what happened to people who did. Renee Walsh from Human Resources saw it twice from the far end of a hallway and looked away both times, hating herself both times, and kept walking. On the second Monday of his employment, at 8:40 in the morning, Marcus was finishing the floor in the third-floor break room. He'd done it properly. Moved the chairs, worked the corners, let it dry in sections. The room smelled like lemon cleaner and burnt coffee. He was crouched by the counter, wiping down the base of the coffee machine, when the door opened and Priya walked in with Trevor and about 9 other employees, mid-conversation, holding cups. 11 people total, and Marcus on the floor. Priya stopped when she saw him. She had a paper cup of black coffee in her right hand, fresh off her own floors machine, still hot enough that she was holding it by the sleeve. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the clean floor. She looked at the cup. Then she turned her wrist over. The coffee came out in one motion, hit the tile in a wide brown arc, and a portion of it caught Marcus across the left forearm as he was rising. He yanked his arm back, faster than any decision, and pressed his sleeve against the skin. The burn shot up through the muscle bright and immediate, locking his jaw. Nobody moved to help him. Someone made a small sound that might have been shock and might have been the start of a laugh. Priya didn't apologize. She pointed at the spreading puddle with the empty cup still in her hand. "Get on your knees and clean it up," she said. "It's about as filthy as you are." Trevor laughed first, one loud bark, and that gave the others permission. 3 or 4 joined in. The rest just watched, coffee in hand, doing the math on what it would cost them to say something and deciding it cost too much. Marcus stayed still for a moment, arm still pressed to his shirt. Then he looked up and met their faces one at a time, not glaring, not pleading, just looking the way a man looks at a room he intends to remember. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He asked her one question. "Are you sure you want me to clean it up?" The question landed strangely. Not a threat, not a plea, and Priya didn't have a category for it. She recovered in under a second, tilted her head, and smiled. "Isn't that the only thing you're paid to do?" Marcus lowered himself onto the wet tile. He took the cloth from his cart and cleaned the floor while 10 employees and their manager stood over him and watched. When he finished, he wrung out the cloth, put it back, and pushed his cart out of the room without looking at anyone. Something shifted in him in that room, not anger. He'd long ago decided anger was a currency he spent carefully. What changed was the question he was asking. He'd come to Ashcombe to learn how the building worked. Now he wanted to know why the building had let this happen, and would let it happen again tomorrow. Dolores found him at the service sink 10 minutes later, running cold water over his arm. The skin had gone red and tight in a strip about 2 fingers wide. "That needs a bandage and a report," she said. "In that order. Go to Renee in HR, she's decent. She'll write it up properly." Marcus kept his arm under the water and asked whether anyone had ever gone to HR about Priya before. Dolores's face did something complicated. She sat down on an overturned bucket and told him about a man named Felix, who'd worked the loading dock and filed a complaint about Trevor 2 years earlier. And how Felix's schedule got shifted to overnight rotation 11 days later for reasons filed as operational. She told him about a woman in accounts payable who'd reported Priya for something and was then passed over for a raise she'd already been promised twice. She told him about a third person, a young man in facilities, who filed a complaint, waited 4 months, heard nothing, and eventually stopped showing up. "Nobody's ever punished," Dolores said. "That's not how it works here. You don't get punished, you get made uncomfortable until you leave on your own. Then the file says you resigned voluntarily, and everyone's hands stay clean." Marcus shut off the water and dried his arm carefully. He asked if anyone had ever gone above HR, to a vice president, to the board, to anyone. Dolores laughed without any humor in it and said people at the bottom of this building didn't even know the names of the people at the top, and that wasn't an accident. He thought about that on the bus home. He thought about it standing in his kitchen with a bag of ice against his arm. He could walk away from the job the next morning and never think about Ashcombe again, and nothing was stopping him, and no one would blame him. He didn't walk away. At 6:20 the next morning he was on the same bus in the same gray uniform, a bandage taped over his forearm, sleeve rolled down to hide it. He clocked in at 7 and said good morning to the front desk. He also did one thing that morning he told no one about. The officer working the lobby console was a man named Owen, who'd been with the building 6 years and who'd held the freight elevator for a janitor with a full cart on 3 separate occasions when he had no reason to. Marcus stopped at his desk, rolled his sleeve back far enough to show the bandage, and asked a favor, pulled a break room footage from 8:40 the previous morning, copy it to a drive, and keep that drive off the Ashcombe network. Owen looked at the arm for a long moment and asked if Marcus was planning to file something. Marcus said he didn't know yet. He only said footage in this building had a habit of disappearing right when somebody finally went looking for it, and he'd rather have it and not need it. Owen made the copy before his shift ended. Then Marcus took his cart up to 12 and started the east corridor exactly as he had every other day, and nobody noticed anything different about him, because nobody ever noticed him at all. He started watching. Who held the door for him when his cart was full, and who let it swing shut? Who said thank you, and who looked straight through him? Which managers were decent to their teams when the floor was empty, and which ones only turned warm the moment a director walked by? He noted a young analyst on 8 who always moved her bag off the chair so he could reach the corner, and a supervisor on 6 who was generous with everyone right up until a senior partner appeared, at which point the warmth vanished entirely. Those were the surface questions. Underneath them sat a harder one, the one that kept him on that bus every morning. Why had this been allowed to go on so long inside a company this size? Not how. Why? Ashcombe had a code of conduct laminated in every break room. It had an ethics hotline. It had an HR department with 14 people in it. It had all the machinery a company was supposed to have, and that machinery had produced a room where 10 employees watched a manager pour hot coffee on a man's arm and order him to the floor, and not one of them said a word. Machinery that produces that result isn't broken. It's working exactly as someone built it to work. Marcus decided to find out who. He moved slowly, asked no direct questions, kept his head down and his cart moving, and let people talk in front of him, which they did constantly, because a janitor in a hallway is furniture. He learned more in 9 days pushing a cart than he would have learned in 9 months reading reports. Renee Walsh caught him in the stairwell between 3 and 4 on a Thursday. She glanced over her shoulder before speaking, which told him plenty about where she stood in the building. "I heard about the break room," she said. "I want you to know not everyone here is like that. I'm sorry it happened. I'm sorry I'm saying it in a stairwell instead of a meeting." Marcus told her she had nothing to apologize for. She said that wasn't true, and left. He started writing things down, not in a notebook anyone could find, but on a folded sheet in his back pocket, transferred every night into a document at his kitchen table. Dates, times, locations, names of who was present. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory. Just a record, because his father had taught him long ago that the difference between a complaint and a case was documentation. Meanwhile, Priya was preparing for a personnel review she was certain would end in a promotion, and had started telling people so. Trevor told anyone who'd listened that his future at Ashcombe was already locked in, the numbers, the relationships. Both of them believed the building belonged to them. Neither knew that the man they'd put on his knees was writing down everything they did. Watching Marcus come back the morning after the coffee, calm, punctual, silent, Priya drew the only conclusion her worldview allowed: he'd learned his place. She was wrong, and the whole third floor was wrong with her. It would take 11 more days for them to find that out. Trevor escalated first, because escalation was the only direction he knew. He stopped bothering with the pretense of accidents. Finishing a sandwich at his desk, balling up the wrapper, setting it deliberately in front of him, then calling across the floor for Marcus to come get it, keeping his hand on it until Marcus reached him so the handoff happened in front of everyone. He timed these little performances for when the sales floor was fullest. Priya's method was different, and worse in its own way. She started sending Marcus to clean spaces that were already clean. A fourth-floor conference room wiped down that morning, a stairwell landing mopped the night before. She never pretended there was dirt. She'd simply tell him it needed doing and stand at a distance, arms folded, while he did it. The point was never the surface. The point was that she could say a sentence and a man would kneel. Younger employees started copying them. That was the part Marcus hadn't expected, and the part that told him the most. A 26-year-old associate on 3 named Devon began leaving his lunch containers on the credenza instead of the trash, because he'd watched Trevor do it and decided that was what someone with a future did. A pair of new hires in marketing started calling Marcus the gray guy among themselves, not with real malice, but with the easy contempt of people shown that contempt was the local dialect. Marcus understood something then that no report or consultant could have taught him. Cruelty becomes culture without needing a policy or a plan. It only needs the people at the top to model it once, in public, without consequence. Everyone below them treats it as the new standard, because in any organization the behavior that goes unpunished becomes the rule, whatever the laminated card in the break room says. But not everyone was the same, and he made himself notice that too, because a man who only records the cruelty ends up with a false picture of the building. Renee found him again the next Monday, same stairwell landing, a stack of files against her chest. She told him she'd tried to raise the break room incident internally and been told there was no formal complaint on file, so there was nothing to raise. This time Marcus didn't let the apology stand alone. He asked whether she'd ever seen a formal complaint reach the executive level. It took her a while to answer. In 9 years at Ashcombe, she said, she'd personally submitted a number of them upward and never once gotten a single follow-up question, and she'd stopped assuming that was a coincidence around her 5th year. Dolores told him more in pieces, over the sound of the industrial sink. About loading dock workers called names for years who never reported it, because reporting meant walking up to the 3rd floor in work boots to explain yourself to someone who'd already decided what you were. About a woman on the night crew instructed by a director to use only the freight elevator, who'd done it for 6 years without ever asking why, because the question itself felt dangerous. Marcus started keeping other names too, not just the ones who'd humiliated him, whom he already had down with dates and witnesses. The analyst on 8 who moved her bag off the chair. A mailroom worker named Miles who bent down and gathered a spilled stack of paper without being asked and never mentioned it again. A receptionist on 2 who held the door with her foot every time she saw the cart coming and never once looked at him like furniture. A project coordinator on 11 who thanked him every single time he cleaned her office, in a building where almost nobody did. He wrote those names down with the same care as the others, and explained to no one why. Dolores saw him writing once and assumed he was tracking his hours. The 2nd week became the 3rd. The burn on his forearm closed into a strip of shiny pink skin that no longer hurt, though he kept his sleeve rolled down over it from habit. Priya, meanwhile, was behaving like a woman who already had the promotion in writing, reorganizing her team's structure in advance, talking about her department in future tense. In an elevator she told a colleague the review was a formality, that certain people in this building understood how the game was really played, said it loud enough for Marcus, standing 2 feet away with a mop, to hear every word. Trevor was louder about it and less specific, telling the sales floor his numbers made him untouchable and that he had relationships upstairs, more true in his head than anywhere else. Neither of them ever looked at the man emptying the bin under Priya's desk while they discussed their futures. It was in the 3rd week that Marcus stopped thinking of this as a story about 2 unpleasant people. He'd been noticing small inconsistencies for days without connecting them. A maintenance technician on 6 mentioned being written up for arriving late on a morning he could prove he'd been early, the write-up coming from Priya's department, though he didn't even report to her. A woman on the night crew told Dolores that 11 hours of approved overtime had simply vanished from her statement, and when she asked, was told the system had been updated and the hours had never been locked. A 2nd person on the loading dock said almost the same thing about a different pay period. Marcus started tracing the routing. What he found wasn't sophisticated, it didn't need to be. Every internal complaint at Ashcombe, from every floor, funneled through a single intake process before going anywhere else, and that process sat inside a department where Priya had spent 4 years building relationships. Overtime approvals for support staff, janitorial, facilities, and the loading dock night crew passed through that same bottleneck on the way to payroll. One set of hands touched both. Complaints naming certain people simply didn't travel, they arrived, got logged, and stopped. Negative performance notes involving Priya and Trevor were, in at least 2 cases he could trace, revised before archiving, softened, reworded, the specific incident swapped for a vague note about communication style. He knew this because both versions had been left face-up overnight in the same conference room, and because a 4th-floor printer held a queue nobody ever cleared. Renee confirmed the pattern without ever saying she was confirming it. She told him she'd personally logged a complaint about Trevor 18 months earlier from a man on the loading dock. She remembered the reference number because she'd written it on her hand. And when she searched for it 4 months later, the record existed but the attached statement did not. Marcus understood by then that the coffee had never been the real story. It was only the thing that made him look. If Priya had ignored him the way she ignored every other gray uniform, he'd have spent his time studying supply chains and quarterly reports and left the building knowing nothing real about it. She'd put him on the floor, and from the floor he could finally see what the building actually was. He started collecting properly after that, careful, slow. Dates, locations, names of witnesses, reference numbers of complaints that went nowhere, the specific pay periods where hours disappeared, the names of 4 people he could identify who'd been disciplined or reassigned within weeks of raising something. He photographed what was left out in the open and never removed an original from the building, because he knew the moment a document went missing, the story would become about the missing document instead of what it said. Priya caught him at the bulletin board on a Tuesday afternoon. The one outside the 3rd-floor break room, with the reorg notices, the compliance postings, and the ethics line number Marcus now knew rang through to a voicemail box in the very department that buried everything else. He'd been standing there maybe 40 seconds, cart parked beside him, when she rounded the corner with 2 colleagues. She stopped, looked at the board, looked at him, and smiled the way she always did with an audience. "Don't strain yourself trying to understand things meant for educated people," she said. "You only need to understand your mop." One colleague laughed. The others studied the carpet. Marcus turned from the board and looked at her, and what he did next would keep her up that night without her being able to explain why. He smiled, not defiant, not bitter, just small and almost patient, the look of a man listening to someone say something they're about to find out was wrong. He said nothing. He took the handle of his cart and moved past her down the hall. Priya stood there a moment after he'd gone. For 3 weeks she'd operated on one assumption that had never once failed her: people below her were afraid of her. That was the mechanism why the write-ups worked, why complaints stopped, why nobody from the loading dock ever came up to 3. Fear was the load-bearing wall of everything she'd built. And this man wasn't afraid of her. Had never been afraid of her. She ran back through it in her head and couldn't find a single moment, from the day he arrived, when she'd seen fear on his face. Not with the coffee. Not with the pointless cleaning. Not on his knees in front of a room full of her own people. He'd been calm every time, and calm wasn't the same as broken. She'd been reading one as the other from the start. The question arrived fully formed and wouldn't leave: why had this man never once been afraid of her? She started watching him after that, which was the first mistake that cost her something. She noticed him at the bulletin board again. She noticed him near the 4th-floor payroll printer at a time she assumed he had no business being there, not knowing the cleaning rotation had shifted 9 days earlier and the 4th floor was now on his morning schedule. She'd never read a cleaning rotation in her life. She also noticed Renee from HR standing in that same stairwell at the same time as the janitor, twice. By the end of the week she'd convinced herself Marcus Reed was building a complaint against her. She was closer to right than she knew, and further from the real scale of it than she could have imagined. She brought the theory to Trevor over drinks on a Thursday. He laughed at first, told her she was worrying about a man who cleaned toilets. She told him a man who cleaned toilets had access to every floor in the building at hours nobody else was around, and watched his expression change. They agreed to move first. The plan wasn't clever, it didn't need to be, because in 4 years neither of them had ever needed a clever plan. They'd allege Marcus had entered a restricted area on 4 and accessed documents he had no clearance for. Trevor would say he saw him. Priya would file it, and because she filed it, it would clear intake in a day instead of dying there like everything else. Marcus would be gone before he could finish assembling whatever he was assembling. Renee received the allegation the following Monday morning and knew within 10 minutes it was false. The badge log for the restricted fourth-floor corridor showed no entry under Marcus's credentials on the date in question, and Trevor's own calendar placed him in a meeting that had been rescheduled. She raised both points in writing and was told termination decisions for support staff didn't require badge verification, and that the matter was being handled at the department level. Her authority ended exactly there, and both she and the person telling her knew it. Marcus was called into a third-floor conference room at 4 that afternoon. Priya was already seated when he walked in. She slid a single sheet across the table, a termination notice dated that day, the allegation summarized in one line, a signature block at the bottom. Trevor stood behind her chair by the window, arms crossed, wearing an expression he'd clearly been practicing since lunch. Priya told him slowly, wanting it to be the sentence he remembered, that this was what happened when people forgot their position. Marcus picked up the sheet and read it, both sides, taking his time while the room waited for him to say something about the accusation. He set it back down and looked at her. "Is tomorrow morning's board meeting still happening?" The room went still. Trevor's arms dropped. The Ashcombe board met 4 times a year. The dates weren't published inside the company, and the location wasn't on any internal calendar a cleaning staff member could access. Something in Priya's face slipped before she could stop it, and her voice had lost most of its authority by the time she asked how a janitor knew about a closed meeting that hadn't been announced anywhere in the building. Marcus didn't answer. He left the termination notice on the table, stood, pushed in his chair, and walked out. Priya sat there long after the door closed. For the first time in 4 years in these walls, she didn't feel like she was winning. The notice landed in Priya's inbox at 6:50 the next morning. Before she'd even reached her floor, the chairman of Ashcombe Industries would be attending the all-company meeting at 9, along with the full executive board. She read it 3 times in the elevator. It said nothing about a board meeting, and that detail sat in her chest like a stone, because it meant Marcus Reed had known about something this notice hadn't even mentioned. Walter Reed did not attend all company meetings. In 4 years she'd seen him in the building maybe twice, both times at a distance, moving through the lobby surrounded by people. He was a name on the letterhead, a signature on the annual report. And the fact that he was coming today of all days produced a cold feeling under her ribs that she immediately relabeled as opportunity. She went to work, messaging every third-floor supervisor to have their areas spotless by 8:30, clearing the reception desk down to the visitor log, walking the corridor herself twice checking baseboards. At 7:15, Marcus came off the service elevator in his gray uniform, pushing his cart exactly as he had every morning since he was hired. Priya stopped dead in the corridor and stared. She'd signed the termination notice herself. She'd watched him read it. It had gone to intake, and intake had confirmed receipt. There was no version of the process in which this man should have badged into the building at 7:15 on a Tuesday. And yet the doors had opened for him, and the security desk had said good morning, and here he was with his cart. Employees were already gathering in the open area near the third-floor atrium where the meeting would be held, 30, then 40, arranging chairs, checking the projector, moving with the faint nervousness of people expecting someone important. Priya made a decision in front of all of them. If Marcus had somehow slipped past the termination, he'd leave a different way, and everyone watching would understand what it cost to make her uncertain. She grabbed a cleaning cloth off his own cart, walked 6 steps, and threw it on the floor at his feet. The room went quiet in stages. "You want to work here that badly," she said. "Get on your knees, clean the floor one last time, and get out of my company." Trevor laughed from near the projector, loud and pleased, and a few people near him made the sound people make when they aren't sure laughing is safe. Marcus looked down at the cloth on the tile, then up at Priya. He didn't kneel. He just stood there, hands at his sides, and the refusal was so quiet it took the room a full second to register that it had happened. Priya turned toward the reception desk and told them to call security, her voice coming out higher than she meant it to. 2 officers rounded the corner from the lobby, unhurried, unsure what they'd been called for. Behind them, the executive elevator opened. An older man in a dark suit stepped out, flanked by 6 members of the Ashcombe board, all still holding folders from a meeting that had started at 7 and ended 9 minutes earlier. He looked to be about 70, silver haircut close, walking with the unhurried pace of a man who'd never once needed to rush. The entire atrium went silent at once, chairs stopping mid-scrape, 40 people turning together. Walter Reed, chairman of Ashcombe Industries. Priya recovered fastest. She stepped forward, hand already extended, expression rebuilt into something warm and professional, positioning herself to be the first person he spoke to. Walter walked past her, didn't slow, didn't glance at her hand, didn't acknowledge she'd moved. He crossed the atrium floor while 40 people watched and stopped in front of the janitor who'd just been ordered to his knees. Nobody in the room understood what they were looking at. Walter's eyes went to Marcus's left forearm. The sleeve had ridden up during the exchange over the cloth, and the strip of shiny pink skin was visible, 2 weeks healed, still unmistakably a burn. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned to face the room. Who did this? Priya's face lost its color. Trevor's laugh cut off mid-breath. 40 people stood in an atrium trying to work out why the chairman of a 14-floor company was asking about an injury to a member of the cleaning staff, and why he was asking in a voice with nothing polite left in it. Walter didn't wait for an answer. Marcus Reed is my only son. The silence that followed had weight to it. Somebody's tablet slipped and hit a chair, nobody picked it up. The truth came apart in the room in pieces, each one worse than the last. The man in the gray uniform wasn't a poor janitor scraping by on an hourly wage. He was the chairman's only son, the man the board had quietly been preparing for years to eventually take over the company. He'd chosen to start at the bottom himself, nobody assigned him there, nobody forced him into it. He'd asked for the lowest position in the building because he'd decided he wasn't going to run a company he'd only ever seen from the top floor. If he was ever going to hold authority over 2,000 people, he wanted to first find out what it felt like to be one of the people nobody looked at. Walter had agreed and told no one, no executive, no director, nobody in HR. Marcus had never once used his father's name, never mentioned it, never let it work in his favor. He'd ridden the bus. He'd worn the resoled shoes. He'd asked Dolores which supply closet to use and let her teach him the building he was going to inherit. He'd wanted to know how the people of Ashcombe Industries would treat him when they were certain he had nothing to give them. 3 weeks had been enough to find out. As for the termination, it had never actually taken effect. Contract support staff at Ashcombe were engaged through a facilities agreement, and every separation under that agreement required a final confirmation signature from the chairman's office before it ever reached the badge system. Priya had never known that, because in 4 years she'd never needed to. Nobody at that level had ever been worth the paperwork. The confirmation had landed on Walter's desk at 5:40 the evening before. He'd read the name and hadn't signed. But Marcus didn't ask for Priya and Trevor to be fired simply for humiliating him, and that was the part that changed the shape of the room. He walked to the front, pulled a folder from the lower shelf of his cart, and set it on the table beside the projector. He laid it all out, complaints that had been received and then stopped moving, with reference numbers spanning 4 departments over 2 years. Overtime hours belonging to night crew support staff, loading dock workers, and facilities employees that had vanished between approval and payroll, with the specific pay periods and the names of people never paid for them. For employees reassigned to worse shifts, passed over for promised raises, or pushed into resigning within weeks of speaking up. Performance reports involving Priya and Trevor that had been quietly revised before archiving, original and replacement language side by side. 2 signed statements, one from Dolores, one from Renee, the only 2 people in the building who'd told him the truth when they still believed he was nobody. And last, a video file that had never touched the Ashcombe network, because Marcus had asked a security officer named Owen to preserve a copy the morning after it was recorded. Timestamped 8:40, 2 weeks earlier, Priya turning her wrist deliberately over a clean floor. The coffee striking Marcus's arm. Marcus pulling back. Priya pointing at the puddle while a room full of employees watched a man lower himself onto wet tile. It played on the projector in front of 40 people, several of whom had been in that break room and laughed. Nobody was laughing now. Priya started to apologize. She hadn't known. If she'd understood the situation, she never would have acted that way. It had been a stressful period and she'd misjudged. Trevor called it a joke, twice. Marcus answered without raising his voice, the way he'd answered everything for 3 weeks. You're not sorry you did it. You're only sorry you found out who you did it to. He let that sit, then added the part that mattered more. Their mistake had never been picking the wrong man. Their mistake was believing there was a right one. Priya and Trevor were suspended within the hour, pending a formal investigation run by an outside firm rather than anyone inside the building. Employees who'd taken part in burying complaints and altering records were placed under review too, including 2 people in intake whose signatures appeared on documents that no longer matched their attachments. Every statement the investigators eventually relied on came from employees who'd stayed silent for years and only spoke once they were sure it would no longer cost them their jobs. That afternoon, in the chairman's office with the door closed, Marcus asked his father not to turn any of it into a personal reckoning. If people were punished in proportion to how badly they'd insulted the chairman's son, he said, the company would learn exactly the wrong lesson. That the offense was insulting the wrong person, not the behavior itself. He wanted every case judged on evidence and conduct, held to the standard that should have applied when the victims were a man on the loading dock or a woman on the night crew with no famous last name at all. Walter agreed, and made it a condition of the investigation. The repairs took longer than the suspensions. Employees who'd been retaliated against were found and made whole. Felix got his original schedule back, plus compensation for the 2 years of overnight rotations he'd been pushed into after filing a complaint. The woman in accounts payable got her promised raise, backdated. The young man from facilities who'd waited 4 months for an answer and eventually stopped showing up was tracked down and offered his job back. The complaint intake system was pulled out from under any single department's control. Reports now routed simultaneously to an outside reviewer and the board's audit committee, so no one person could ever again sit between a complaint and the people who needed to see it. Every payroll record for support staff over the past 2 years was audited line by line, and every vanished hour was paid back with interest. Renee was given a central role in rebuilding HR. Not because she'd known who Marcus was, because she hadn't, but because for 9 years she'd kept submitting complaints that went unacknowledged, had checked a badge log on a termination when told not to question it, and had apologized to a janitor in a stairwell when there was nothing in it for her. Dolores was thanked personally and privately, in a way that caught her off guard and that she initially tried to wave off. Marcus reminded her she'd warned him about Priya and Trevor on his 3rd day, when he was nothing to her but a new man with a cart. She'd shown him the supply closets. She'd told him to put ice on his arm. She'd sat on an overturned bucket and told him the truth about a company that had taken nearly 2 decades from her without ever once asking her opinion about anything, all without knowing who he was. That was the entire point. The board expected Marcus to move into an executive office the following month. His father had one ready. He turned it down. He told Walter, and later the board, that 3 weeks with a mop didn't qualify him to lead 2,000 people, it had only taught him what the bottom of the building looked like, and a man who'd seen 1 floor of a company wasn't equipped to run all 14. He asked instead to spend time in operations, in finance, in the warehouses and regional offices, learning each function from the inside before anyone handed him a title. Walter agreed, and something in him settled that hadn't settled in a long time. For years he'd assumed his son wanted to inherit the company. That day he understood his son wanted to deserve it. The culture at Ashcombe Industries began shifting over the following month. Slowly, unevenly, the way real change actually happens. People who'd never spoken up before discovered there was finally a channel that didn't run through anyone invested in silence, and they used it. Supervisors who'd treated a title as a license adjusted, some quickly, some only after watching what happened to the ones who didn't. Devon, the associate on 3, quietly went back to using the trash can and never explained why. Marcus still walked the corridor outside the 3rd-floor break room. He had no reason to anymore. He did it anyway. The burn on his forearm faded over time into a faint mark most people wouldn't notice, and he never wanted to forget it, because the moment he'd been ordered to his knees taught him something no business school ever could. If you want to know what someone is actually made of, don't watch how they treat the person in charge when he walks into the room. Watch how they treat the janitor when they're certain nobody who matters is looking. Status, money, and titles can vanish in an afternoon. Priya Sandhu and Trevor Voss weren't wrong because they failed to recognize the chairman's son. They were wrong from the very first moment they believed a poor janitor deserved to be humiliated at all, because dignity was never about a title, and kindness only means something when it's given to people who can never do a single thing for you in return.